The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor, Thomas Goss. Back in my very early 20s, I guess that would be about 4 decades ago now, I used to work in a guitar factory wiring pickups. It was the kind of funky workplace where local musicians would come and go, intrigued at the prospect of helping build some of the finest instruments in the industry, but then moving on to better paid day jobs or night jobs. One of these was an ex-bandmate of mine, who I helped get the job of working alongside me casting the pickups once I'd wired them. We had our own little corner of the warehouse where we could do what we liked, and I often played concert music from my vast supply of cassette tapes. My buddy was quite a talker, and constantly wanted to explore why people liked different kinds of music. As I remember it, he wasn't all that impressed with Beethoven or Mozart, or even Ravel or Tchaikovsky. But he had a visceral reaction to Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique when I first played it for him. He thought that was some of the best, most relatable music he'd ever heard, from beginning to end. There wasn't any use talking musical history or musicology with him, though he was an impressively intelligent and well-informed guy. He just knew what he liked, and Berlioz was on the very same high level as his favorite rock bands. I've thought about my friend's love of Berlioz recently, as we come close to the end of this very long lecture series, and the reasons why he found the Symphonie Fantastique so compelling, as a complete outsider to concert repertoire. And I'm pretty sure that it isn't just the work's bombastic and obsessive qualities, or its rather heavy metal ending with an execution and then a Black Sabbath, though those would have been pretty convincing draw cards for an early 1980s hard rock bassist. Even more so, though, it's the fact that Berlioz's form is always based on dramatic decisions more than formal ones. It's a kind of subtle reversal of Beethoven in a way. Beethoven's complete mastery of form involved an enormous amount of experimentation, pushing at its boundaries to see what he could get away with. Ultimately, as we see in his later symphonies, string quartets, and piano sonatas, the intellectual development of each work would tend toward the maximum of emotional impact. Berlioz was just taking this tendency one step further, and making the form completely a servant of an emotional arc, with heavily dramatic colors and gestures in his orchestral scoring. And that is exactly what's happening with the structure of this rondo. In a Beethoven symphonic rondo, certain sections might return with similar scoring, launching other episodes or variations on the main theme. But Berlioz is specifically painting a picture of a progression of events, almost like the soundtrack to an imaginary film. So when he returns to certain thematic elements, they'll always move the story forward, which in this case is literally the road to damnation. And he'll do it in a way that's designed to keep his audiences riveted, whether they're musical elites, casual concert-goers, or rock musicians. And I've been all three. Over the course of this lecture, we'll see the rondo theme go in ever more ominous directions, as the Dies Irae theme attempts to reassert itself, until finally it bursts forth into a mighty duet with the rondo's fugue subject. But let's pick things up from where we left off in the last lecture. following the snarling combination of open and stopped solo horns that wrapped up the previous episodes of brash horns and limping winds. Berlioz moves to a transitional passage that's as programmatic as it is structural. Creepy pizzicato lower strings lurking around the bottom of the sound picture, trading off riffs with soft but intensely solid off-4 bassoons. All this tiptoeing around is merely going to set up the re-entry of the dies irae that we'll see on the next screen, readying the listener's ear and dramatic expectations, not to mention the return to C minor. We'll get there in a little while. First, though, a closer look at the architecture of Berlioz's functional scoring. Once again, we see the use of the poco forte marking, which appears to have a slightly different meaning than earlier in the movement, when it meant a little under forte but not mezzo forte. Here it means protrude clearly from the texture but not too strongly. This second definition is what a lot of section players will assume that poco forte means most of the time, especially those who see the term used a lot in Brahms, essentially poco of the forte. That might make it under mezzo forte in a lot of instances, like this one right here, which is why, to avoid confusion, poco forte should probably be abandoned in today's scores, though I personally find it hard to resist sometimes. Interestingly, Berlioz avoids the perfectly accessible low F in the basses, and instead starts their sneaky little statement with a unison-sounding F2. This avoids putting too much weight on the downbeat, though from there the basses drop to track the cellos at the customary octave below. Notice the evolving harmony, the line playing over the outline of an F-dominant 7 chord, which, by adding the flat 9 on G flat, sets up the transition to an F-sharp diminished chord in the answering bassoons, which start their line playing upward as the cellos and basses descend. On the second bar of their entrance, the E-flat horns chime in with slightly blaring-sounding E-flat pitches, underlining the 7th of the diminished chord, sounding down a major 6th from their written pitches on those Cs, remember. Halfway through their third bar, the bassoons resolve their F-sharp diminished chord into a simple descending E-flat major chord. And right on that half bar, the lower strings re-enter the picture. This loosening of trading off entrances to 2.5 bars keeps the listener guessing, and also introduces the slightly diabolical element of recurring 5-beat phrases. Just as the bassoons did, the lower strings change their harmonic outline on the 6th beat of their phrase, to a descending A-flat major chord, just as the bassoons start their second entrance on the bottom 2 notes of that chord, A-flat and C. We'll drop down to the continuation of this little game in a minute on the rest of this screen. Let's observe those swarming fingered tremolos in the upper strings. They start with an A diminished triad, the top part of the F7 chord outlined by the basses and cellos, alternating with B-flat thirds. That harmonic accompaniment stays relevant through a full 3 bars, and might have even gone another 1.5 bars without any conflicts, but Berlioz drops the violas down a minor third to create an F-sharp diminished 7 chord, alternating with a G minor triad. Halfway through the 5th bar of this screen, Berlioz simply reverses the direction of the fingered tremolos in second violins and violas, to shift to alternating E-flat and D major chords. These stay in place for a full 5 beats. Remember that we're thinking in 5-beat phrases now. And then on the shift to A-flat in the bassoons and lower strings, the violas play a simple tonic A-flat note under the violins, alternating between C minor and B minor thirds. All along, the upper strings have been reducing their dynamic strength from piano down to triple P, as we see in the violas. Then in the violins a few bars later, all the way down to the marking presque rien, which means nearly nothing, showing, as we saw in previous movements, that Berlioz was also introducing the concept of niente to the symphonic orchestra. You can see that the incredibly soft little fragments of motive that set up the next section prove that Tchaikovsky didn't invent the concept of quadruple piano as some sort of affectation in his 6th symphony. The idea had been around at least since the start of the Romantic era. As to our ongoing discussion of the functionality of the upper strings on this screen, we see the violas drop out after a couple of bars, after which the second violins settle on a held C, with the first violins holding an E-flat by the end of the passage. This persistent minor third will stay relevant across all the remaining chord changes in the melodic instruments. Speaking of which, let's take another look at the little continuing game between bassoons and lower strings. Berlioz has tightened up the dialogue to competing entrances every bar and a half, or 3 beats instead of 5. This will continue until the final little fragment of C-C-D-E-flat gets tossed around the different instruments and then brings the whole episode to an end. We'll get there in a few minutes, I promise, and have a listen to how this little jigsaw puzzle all fits together. But let's get back to the start of this system. The bassoons are continuing walking upward across the outline of an A-flat major chord, with the lower strings coming in halfway through that first bar on a nice mediant C. Alongside them, the E-flat horns repeat their descending E-flats, this time the dominant of the A-flat chord. But as we see in the next bar, it was all just a way of getting back to an F-sharp diminished harmony, which is traded off between lower strings and bassoons for the next couple of bars, eventually settling on our final destination of C minor. Notice the horns chiming in one more time, with very low written pitches in old notation bass clef. This would mean that the sounding pitches are only up a minor third, rather than down a major sixth. And if that's the case, then written middle C in treble clef is the exact same pitch as the old notation C below middle C, which is one strong reason why old notation bass clef was eventually scrapped for its sheer absurdity. But that doesn't let you off the hook. To become a qualified score reader, you're just going to have to learn to recognize all the old notation pitches for what they are. Just don't ever use old notation in your own scores, even if you're writing something in a romantic or classical style. Anyway, 6 notes out of the motive played by the bassoons is echoed in the pizzicato lower strings, then restated in the bassoons, then fragmented down further to just 4 pitches stepping on each other's toes, leading to these low double bass A-flats resolving to the bottom note of a C minor 6-3 chord, alongside the held E-flat in the bassoons, with the violins and violas hitting a stack of tremolo C minor thirds above, then backing off quickly. Probably from a balance perspective, the extreme dynamics are a little idealistic. In reality, taking these marks literally would make the thematic continuity here inaudible. But the implied restraint beautifully sets up the ear for the savagery of those tremolo C minor thirds, and the return of the dies irae in the next passage. The scoring of this next screen is simple enough on the surface, with a few harmonic factors holding over from the previous page, accompanying snatches of the dies irae, intertwined with fragments of the rondo theme. But, as is usual with Berlioz, just dig a little deeper, and you reveal the revolution in form and orchestration. First, let's look at the harmonic framing, a slimmed-down version of the previous C minor 6-4 chord, with basses and bassoons still holding that very low G minor 6th, and violins playing a C minor 3rd above. Notice that the second violins, a little louder than the firsts, correct to a B-flat in the 3rd bar, changing the chord to an E-flat 6-3 chord to harmonize with the melody's pitches of B-flat and G, after which the strings drop out entirely, leaving the bassoons to carry on with their held E-flat, but only with the 3rd and 4th players, not all 4 bassoonists. This is probably done to reduce tone weight, especially playing under the triple piano violas coming up, rather than to save half the bassoonists from playing too long a note. It's child's play for them to hold a super soft note for 12 bars of 6/8 time at 104 to the dotted quarter. Okay, so now for the juicy part. The Dies Irae, scored across E-flat and C horns, doubling cellos at first. These are great solo moments for the low horn players, taking advantage of their ease of playing down in the basement, though any pro horn player should technically be able to play equally well in any register. It's just that asking the second and fourth horns to play lower puts them more in registers where they may already be playing anyway in the harmonic scheme, and it also relieves the higher players of having to radically reshape their embouchures at the drop of a hat. Here we also see Berlioz using the natural horn tuning of each player to its best effect, with either player getting the bulk of their written Gs, their third partials, as those notes occur in the melodic line. The concert B-flats written as Gs on E-flat horn, remember. That simply leaves the pitches around those Gs to be played as the occasional stopped or half-stopped notes, the timbral irregularity of which will be smoothed over by doubling with more prominent soli cellos. All the same, notice the poco forte marking, which I feel is meant to give the horns a slight edge here, rather than merging indistinguishably into the cellos. We'll talk about those intervening violas in a moment, but let's stick with the Dies Irae and the horns for now. In the second fragment, Berlioz once again takes advantage of optimum pitches in natural tuning, with the E-flat second horn covering the sounding B-flats as written open Gs, and the C basso fourth horn taking the single open C. That just leaves a deliciously sinister half-stopped F-sharp at the end in the second horn part. But notice, it's not the cellos doubling on unison pitches this time, but solely double basses taking the octave below. This brings up a further issue of how doubling helps to stabilize low horn pitches, whether by doubling with another horn, or another brass instrument like a trombone, or any other low instrument like bassoons or low strings. Berlioz shows that doubling at the octave below is also a technique that can work, though it can result in a rougher, wilder sound, which is probably what he intended. That just leaves the violas, which I feel are perfectly scored for their quality of tone across their lowest strings. When played very softly, with a looser bow stroke, these little variations on the rondo theme make their entrance with a haunting, edge-of-the-teeth kind of sound. For an added level of chaotic spookiness, the rondo theme is transformed into chromatic pitches rather than diatonic ones, especially unnerving in parallel minor thirds, eventually getting all the way down to a rock-bottom open C by the last bar. This next section, the reintroduction of the rondo theme in chromatic form, really doesn't require a huge amount of explanation. Though it sounds a bit nebulous to the ear, the mathematics are fairly simple, simpler than they'd be with diatonic pitches and strict rules of counterpoint. Berlioz sets up his own rules. Each new entrance must emerge from a unison pitch with the next highest voice of the ensemble. So the violas take their entrance pitch of D from the first note of the cellos walking down in the sixth bar of this screen. Then the second violins emerge from the same B-flat of the violas. And finally the firsts take the A of their entrance from the seconds. Next rule. Each entrance must occur one bar later than the one before it. So we see the violas entering 4 bars after the cellos, and the second violins 5 bars after that, and the first violins coming in 6 bars after the seconds. And, after the syncopated bar on the next screen, the next episode starts in 7 bars. Final rule. The general direction of all lines is parallel motion, harmonizing in relationships that will eventually fill out to a diminished seventh chord. The only contrary motion allowed is under the bar of an entrance, and only in a way that creates the illusion of the independence of line, but is actually just a device for repositioning subordinate lines into the parallel harmony. Add to this a couple of muted but flaring written Cs in our low horns from the last page, underlining that diminished harmony, and a very gradual crescendo on single, then double players on that upturned bass drum, and you get one of the most signature classic builds in early Romantic scoring. But that was just the first half of the build. Now let's look at the second half. As we just heard, the violins, violas, and cellos had been climbing chromatically with parallel diminished chords. On the downbeat of the next bar, the basses suddenly enter the picture, providing a root F sharp, after which we see the rest of the orchestra respond with these syncopated chords. We haven't had a Tutti chord diagram in a while, so why not this bar? Notice how the winds play a nice little closed voicing of a full diminished seventh chord above, with first oboe and piccolo clarinet doubling the pitch of C6. The horns cover that lower stack of C minor thirds, providing some much-needed ballast to the texture. The strings are the most interesting of all, though. The violins and violas all play double stops that not only nicely fill in the middle of the sound picture, but also are the most convenient to play relative to the position that each player's fingers are already in. The first violinists play up a third on a stopped A on the E string, and merely add the open A string below. The seconds are already playing E flat on the D string, so it's simple for their next finger to reach over to add F sharp on the E string. Then all the violists have to do is turn that note of C5 into the easy double stop of an E flat sixth. Interestingly, the cellos double that lower pitch of E flat, which is already being covered by the very pungent first horn. All of this adds up to a very full-bodied but somewhat wild chord, with a lot of strength in the middle and brilliance on top. And with that, the chromatic build is off and running again, this time with more well-defined, ongoing contrapuntal motion. This is one of those passages that looks and sounds more difficult than it's actually constructed. But once again, Berlioz is operating with a set of mathematical rules, which he adjusts as the passage progresses to ever tighten the harmonic knot until it bursts forth on the next screen. So let's break it down to more comprehensible elements. To begin with, there are really only 4 distinct elements to the game here. The first and easiest to absorb is the top line, played by a unison of flutes and first violins, joined halfway through by E-flat clarinet as the passage becomes ever more urgent. For the whole 9 bars, this line will be moving chromatically, each new pitch moving up or down only by a half step. Well and good. But this rule does not apply to the counter melody played by a unison of first oboe and second violins, with the C clarinet adding its weight on the 6th bar. While there's plenty of chromatic motion, this line seems determined to settle on pitches suggesting diatonic minor scales, like F minor at first, and then sticking with G minor after that. This not only creates an intriguing variety of harmonic relationships, but it also ratchets up the tension, as the 2 lines get ever closer together, the counter melody gaining ground against the top melody little by little. This diatonic tempering of the interplay is further underlined by the other 2 elements, a bass line in the lower strings, and these repeated harmony notes in the violas, with the bassoons lending some more static weight to both lines, mostly the bass line. As you can see, With the exception of an E flat in the cellos and a couple of leading tone F sharps, these parts are devoid of accidentals for the first 6 bars, revealing a fairly simple scheme of a pattern rising step by step over pitches that foreshadow the eventual return to C major in the next big passage. The C horns chip in a little, playing simple open pitches that help fill in the harmonic texture, pushing from F sharp diminished to G minor. At the 7th bar, the formula breaks up, with bassoons and cellos first harmonizing with the countermelody, then continuing to rise chromatically inside an enclosing augmented 4th octave in double basses and violas. This breaks apart again in the last bar, with bassoons, violas, and double basses harmonizing under the countermelody, and the cellos putting all the motion above into a more diatonic context. As all these devious little calculations have been going on, the rolled bass drum continues to gradually build underneath, egging on the emotional edge to all the intellectual horseplay. With 3 more massive screens of Tuttis to go from here, you might well be wondering when this very detailed lecture is ever going to end. And while I wouldn't blame you, the honest truth is that with this huge expansion of scoring comes a simplifying of function in all the parts. So it paradoxically becomes simpler to explain the bigger the texture gets. I'll still map out a few of these monster chords as we go, though, just for fun. This screen in particular will have several charts, but first let me take a minute to explain a little point that may be bothering some viewers. Enharmonic pitches. In quite a few places, Berlioz will spell some pitches in a chord as flats instead of the sharps they should be in order for the chord to make sense, or vice versa. Why is this? Sometimes the reason is merely practicality of string fingering. When the same pitch on a string instrument goes between flats, naturals, or sharps, on the same written pitch, the fingertip is supposed to slide, for instance from a G natural sliding up to a G sharp. To make matters even more fun, in a passage like the one we just heard from the first violins, the fingering is designed to work over a pattern that contains just those same slides up in the middle of every other bar, but repositioning the fingers in sets of 2 bars. When Berlioz gets to the E7 chord that starts the next screen, he chooses to spell the median pitch of G sharp enharmonically as A flat, to avoid a fingertip slide on the downbeat. And then, of course, the flute and E-flat clarinet have to follow suit with the same written pitch, transposed in the same relationship on the clarinet, in order to reduce confusion for the conductor. But that isn't always the reason sometimes, as we'll see in the next 2 chords. Berlioz makes an enharmonic substitution because the pitch is part of a pivot to another chord. These E-flats in first oboe and second violins should be D sharps, because the chord here is a B7, but the ultimate destination is F sharp diminished. Especially in such a furious moment of smashing around, Berlioz thinks it wise to just indicate the position most relevant to the harmony which leads forward, a shift from F sharp diminished to C major. Hanging on to the D sharp would really be stretching the player's sense of where they were in the evolving direction of the piece, and changing the spelling from D sharp to E flat right in the middle of the proceedings could very well provide a place in the score where players trip up from time to time. With all that explained, then charting these huge tutti chords might make more sense. Berlioz just starts slamming away on offbeats of a 3/4 pulse over the framework of the existing 6/8 time. He manages a bright but fairly rich sound, not as fat as it could be in the mid-range with the heavy brass and C horns held back for 4 bars. The winds and cornets nicely spell out the essentials of that B7 chord we just mentioned a minute ago. Flute, first oboe, and C clarinet above in an omit 5 voicing, and then E-flat clarinet, second oboe, and A2 cornets in an octave below in an omit 3 voicing, with the bassoons playing an open B5 at yet another octave below. Their pitches are doubled by cellos and violas, with basses taking the octave B below. The violins cover the missing seventh on the pitch of A4 for the bassoons and middle strings, open A strings at the bottom of these widely spaced double stops, the top pitches of which double the top two winds in this chord, flute and first oboe. Meanwhile, the E-flat horns bellow away on that low E-flat octave, providing the equivalent of a median major third, D sharp in other words, for basses and cellos. I know it looks really weird with all those enharmonic E-flats in the chord, but it will all make sense in a minute. What follows is one of the riskiest places in the entire symphony. It all has to do with speed of sound issues, a factor of which Berlioz was seemingly unaware, to judge from his grandiose plans in the Grand Treatise on Instrumentation, to have mass orchestras filling auditoriums the size of football fields. But even on a smaller, standard concert hall stage, percussionists and brass players sitting in the back may have to anticipate the beat a little so that the end result locks together with the rest of the players sitting in front of them. Up to this point, the conductor has been strenuously guiding most of the orchestra on hitting these 3/4 offbeats with precision, and now the rest of the brass section and the timpani have to come in on the beat in 3/4. You'd think this would be easy. Certainly Berlioz intends a kind of simple clunking back and forth between two massive orchestral textures, disjointed in character but perfectly regular in timing. But if the anticipation of the beat from these new players is off by even a fraction, there's a chance that the timing will fall apart and the whole orchestra will sound like it's simply playing together on every offbeat, rather than back and forth. I've heard this happen several times in live concerts. Since we have two orchestral groups fighting it out, why not two separate diagrams? Starting with the same group we just analyzed. Here we can see that most pitches remain in place, as the change from a B7 to an F-sharp diminished is a simple shift upwards from the pitch of B to C, plus dropping in the root of F-sharp below. Thus, flute, both oboes, and first bassoon stay in position for the winds, as do E-flat horns and both violin groups. And now for the changes. Added piccolo on that top C, sounding a minor third above the flute, C clarinet taking over the sounding A5 of the E-flat clarinet from the previous chord, while that E-flat clarinet itself now supplies the sounding C natural an octave below the piccolo. And in second bassoon, that shift from B to C I just mentioned. Violas open out to double that same C below, and fill in the missing C above. Meanwhile, the lower strings and cornets form a triple octave on the root of F-sharp. Cellos and basses leap up a further octave on that root, probably intended as a response to the arc of the first ophicleide player's part. Opposed against these forces, the timpani and the rest of the brass section play an earthy, blasting chord, the loudest pitches of which will ring out in this octave from the E-flat trumpets. The trombones interlock with the trumpets, the alto taking the A in the middle, and the tenors playing those F-sharp thirds below. Then, enclosing the tenors, the C horns play their C octave around them, the timpani battering away in unison with the fourth horn. Grinding away below, the second ophicleide player sits on the root F-sharp, while the first player plays a plodding arpeggiation over the pitches of the F-sharp diminished chord. Here's where modern tubas are at their most superior to the ophicleide, playing with gusto and precision, rather than a tone that's slower to react, somewhat ponderous, and yet easily swallowed by low horns and trombones. Now Berlioz lets the entire string section take over the thematic role, a great contrast to all the blasting around we just heard. It's a more or less unified octave statement at first, with all the players starting on their lowest available pitches, though from there forward the middle strings start to provide some brusque harmonization. If you ever wanted to hear what it sounded like with the entire string section playing on their lower strings most of the time, here's your chance. Little devilish triplets above in winds and horns alternate between A and A-flat diminished chords at first, then C and G7 chords as the theme takes off. It's all a great way to transition forward from those huge syncopated chords back into the rondo theme. Before we turn the page, notice how the rondo theme didn't finish with that little syncopated hook, but instead took all the strings with it in a 4-octave unison scale ripping upwards. This serves both as an exciting setup for the re-entrance of the Dies Irae and an essential repositioning for the new phase of the rondo theme as a terrifically energetic linear texture. And here on this next screen, we see that Berlioz has even marked his intentions with its own title, if it weren't obvious enough already. Dies Irae and Sabbath Round Dance together. And just to stay with the strings for a minute, even though, from the overwhelming octave melody of the Dies Irae, the tonality is clearly in A minor, the strings play their merry dance in G major of all keys. But there's a clever method behind Berlioz's seeming madness. Each bar of the round dance theme has a momentary harmonic compatibility with each pitch of the Dies Irae. This way, Berlioz is able to give both elements to this page a sense of independence, while still staying more or less in the same tonal scheme. First and second violins play the theme in octaves, then unison on the final descent into the swirling continuation of the passage. Violas provide some contrary motion, repeated notes, and harmonization, while the lower strings cover a bass line very similar to what we saw in the Fugato. The timpani kick in some thundering support of the strings, playing over bass notes or related pitches. While all of these madcap antics are going on, a massive octave recap of the Dies Irae gets underway. Just one more diagram, I promise. Here we see that the bottom and the top of this quadruple octave is fairly minimal, with only A2 ophicleides below, and first oboe and E-flat clarinet above. Of course, the intensity of a couple of modern tubas going full bore with marcato accents on that bottom line is a different story. The upper middle line is a little beefier than the top line, second oboe and C clarinet teaming up with both cornets. But the lower middle line is where most of the awesome weight is sitting, with a total of 9 instruments doubling, or should I say no-nuppling, each pitch. All 4 bassoons, all 3 trombones, and both C horns. This fearsome quadruple octave has a wonderfully grim and yet sonorous combined timbre. That fat lower middle line reinforcing the top octave with a massive overtones, and using the added weight beneath for more depth and color. Notice one last thing before I play the first half of this passage, just how many pitches in the C horns are open rather than stopped, and even those A's and B's would only be partially stopped by half or 3/4. This would add all the more weight and intensity, and evenness of tone, with the natural horns Berlioz assumed would be used back when he composed the Symphonie Fantastique in 1830. From this point, the music amps up even further with the introduction of a swirling octave in the upper strings, the violas doubling the second violins, with flute doubling the first violins, and the piccolo stacking yet another octave on top. This line isn't some clever rewrite of the rondo theme, but merely linear texture that jibes harmonically with the ongoing Dies Irae, while also insinuating a kind of contrary motion or harmonization with the first note of each bar. Notice the very long slurs in some bars, especially toward the end of the passage, taking 2 and then 3 bars under one bow. This swirling effect has been imitated and built upon heavily in concert and film scores, all the way up to Hedwig's theme from the Harry Potter cinematic franchise. There's also a fun little compromise in bar 431, where the lower part of that triple octave line dips just past where the second violins can reach, though the violas can easily play that low F sharp. So the second violins simply play up a half step instead of down, then correct to A natural as the line swoops upward again. Meanwhile, the lower strings also commit to supporting the Dies Irae with a pretty solid bass line, albeit in measured 16th note tremolos. It's interesting how they continue to sit on a low A near the end, while both the massive melody and the timpani play a B. But then the dip down to G sharp in the strings, and the jump to E in the timpani help to set up the resolution. And that's where we'll leave this lecture, just before the frantic last few pages of score, with yet more innovations and inspirations like Col Legno Battuto and yet another appearance of the Dies Irae, all culminating in a mad dash to the finish. Thanks so much to all my supporters on Patreon for making this lecture possible, and to all my viewers who've kept me going on this since I started the series last year. Let's finish off this video with a look at all the passages we've studied in order, so you can see how they interconnect dramatically and structurally. Flipping backwards from the swirling strings and the return of the Dies Irae, to the syncopated massive Tutti section, even further back to the chromatic reimagination of the rondo theme, all the way to where we started with creepy interplay between pizzicato strings and soli A4 bassoons. This is some of the best, most imaginative, and certainly most gripping scoring in the whole movement, with extreme tension building upon further suspense, ultimately paying off with a glorious return of all the main elements. Have fun with that, and I'll see you very soon with the conclusion.